Why has a political transition in Libya remained deadlocked for over a decade? Will Libya eventually emerge from its ordeal as a unified state? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Claudia Gazzini of International Crisis Group. Claudia Gazzini's research and reporting on Libya is widely considered among the most informative available on the country's politics, security, and economic affairs. Since 2012, she has been the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for Libya, and during 2017-18 also served as a policy advisor to the head of the UN support mission in Libya. She travels regularly throughout the country. Previously, she worked for the Associated Press and Reuters. Claudia Gazzini, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Hi.
As a first question, I'd like to refer back to a major report you wrote for International Crisis Group last year, in which you expressed optimism about Libya's political transition, suggesting it had finally turned the page. In that report, you identified the establishment of a legal framework for elections and clarity about supreme authority over the armed forces as the two main issues that still required resolution. Yet today, there seems to be no resolution in sight regarding either of these issues, and the political transition is once again in tatters. What went wrong in late 2021, and where do things stand today?
First of all, thank you for having me on this podcast.
Thank you for joining.
It's a pleasure to be talking to this audience about Libya again, which has oftentimes falls off the radar, especially when there is no conflict. Regarding the question you asked me, when Libya signed a ceasefire, Libyan parties, rival factions signed a ceasefire back in October 2020, what followed was a political process. A UN-backed roadmap in November 2020 established that representatives of Libya's various parties were, first of all, going to agree on an interim government, a unity government to bring the country together. And a year later, so by December 2021, there was supposed to be presidential and parliamentary elections. As you mentioned, one of the issues that these UN-backed delegates were supposed to agree upon was the legal framework for elections. And that actually never materialized. So that's one of the first problems that we are dealing with now. Essentially, when elections were agreed on in this roadmap, and it was presidential and parliamentary, the UN, with the agreement of the Libyan delegates, had established that there were going to be various options to try to reach a legal framework for elections. So the first option was to have the rival assemblies, so the Tobruk-based parliament, and the rival assembly based in Tripoli, the High State Council, convene for meetings and agree amongst themselves on a legal framework for elections. According to the UN roadmap, these two assemblies would have had 60 days. 60 days were going to expire in February or early March to reach an agreement. But from the outset, the odds that they would agree on a legal framework for elections were very low. So the UN had already prepared an alternative plan. And that was, should these two assemblies fail, then what was called the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum would kick in. The Libyan Political Dialogue Forum was an assembly of, a forum of 74 delegates representing Libya's various factions.
Meeting under UN auspices.
Meeting under UN auspices. Amongst those 74, there were also 13 representatives of the parliament and 13 representatives of the State Council, the Tripoli-based assembly, and other independent delegates handpicked by the UN, which represented other factions, other municipalities, in some cases tribal leaders, and so on. So the plan B was for these 74 delegates to meet to discuss a roadmap for elections, a legal framework, and have them agree on a solution. Essentially, why was this necessary? Because Libya doesn't have a constitution. To prepare elections, you needed to have an electoral law that defined things like the powers of the president, because it was the first time that Libya post-Gaddafi was going to have a presidential election. They needed to define the eligibility criteria for the president and for the parliamentarians, because it was the two elections were being discussed. And a whole, series of other issues that needed to be fine-tuned and that had been from the outset very controversial.
So basically building the political system from scratch.
From scratch, exactly. And Libya was already divided and still is, between those who support presidential elections, those who oppose presidential elections, believing that this is, a first step towards a return for a dictatorship.
And we're advocating for a parliamentary system.
And they are only advocating for parliamentary elections. And there were also those who were saying, no, this is all rubbish. We can't have elections at all until we complete the constitutional process, because Libya has a draft constitution that was completed in 2017, was supposed to put to a referendum and never was, because of disputes over the law for the referendum, disputes on the content of the constitution. So essentially this agreement on the legal framework for elections was necessary to actually have a consensual and agreed upon electoral process. Now, when Plan A failed, Plan B kicked in, but the delegates of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum never reached an agreement. Throughout May, June, July, there were several meetings held online, some in person, but they ended up being split and bickering most of the time and without being able to reach a consensus. Now, one option for them to forge a consensus was could have been putting it to a vote and telling these 74 delegates, look, you can't agree, so let's sort it out by a majority vote.
Of the delegates? Of
the delegates, amongst the delegates. Because remember, when in February, these same delegates had agreed on a new unity government and a new prime minister, they settled the matter on a vote-based system. And the majority, 50% plus one won. So the idea was, let's try to replicate that same mechanism for the legal framework. But the UN, and at the time there was the UN Special Representative Jan Kubiš, at the last minute decided not to put it to a vote. There are theories as to why that didn't happen, and some people suggest that the decision was taken not to put it to a vote because had it gone to a vote, the faction that was advocating no presidential elections most probably would have won, and having no presidential elections would have been against the UN-backed roadmap, which established simultaneous parliamentary and presidential elections. So essentially, the summer went by without a consensus emerging from the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. So what happened was that with the blessing of the UN envoy, the Libyan parliament, the Tobruk-based House of Representatives, took the matter in their own hands. And in September, they published their own presidential election law. And the following month, they published the parliamentary election law. So this was a one-sided move, a unilateral move by members of the parliament, not even all of them. It was, a committee was tasked to draft this law, and it wasn't even put to a vote. And controversies from then on sort of continued. First, it was that the law wasn't voted on, then the content of the law that established an extremely strong presidential system where the elected president was going to have full authority over this, was going to be the supreme commander of the armed forces, nominate a prime minister, and so on. So the fact that there was no consensus really over the electoral framework, in part because of mishandlings, in part because the Libyan factions were still at loggerheads over this very existential thing that they feel strongly about, was one of the failures that occurred throughout this year. And of course, the other, this idea of having elections at the end of the year was predicated also on the belief that, building on this positive momentum of having finally a unity government, finally, Libya did not have two rival governments and parallel institutions. Mm-hmm. That what would follow would be, a unification of the military and a unification of the financial institutions, and all this, positive energy would mean that the Libyan factions would more easily walk towards electoral, walk along the electoral roadmap, having settled these issues. But there was no progress on the military unification. Essentially, the narrative is the same old narrative that we've heard in Libya for a long time. Without an elected president, we will not relinquish power to interim authorities that were not chosen by the people. This was the mantra of the Eastern-based Libyan National Army faction headed by Khalifa Haftar. So they were using this argument of, without an elected president, we're not going to unify and we're not going to surrender, let's say, our forces. And
so
of
the
course,
militias stayed in place, effectively.
Exactly, and the other side, the Tripoli-based armed forces, were also very, wary to unify into a military structure that was headed by Haftar, against whom they were at war until not long ago. So right. These is the main reasons of the failures of why we didn't see further progress throughout this past year. And I must say, there's also a third factor, which is, the usual conundrum in Libya of the status quo, what we call the status quo lobby, and what, UN officials in the past have lobbied called dinosaurs, which is...
These are the vested interests.
Yes, the factions that have a vested interest to keep hold of power, keep their seats. And of course, their job is easily accomplished because these are the same people that can tap into state resources and state funds, right, to support their cause for the status quo. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that those in power have access to funds. Having access to funds, you can perpetuate your interests. So this is the reason for the failure to see major progress in the second half of this past year.
And where do things stand today? I believe the December elections were canceled very shortly before they were meant to be conducted. And now it's basically been kicked into the long grass, and everything is kind of in a state of suspended animation. Is that a correct reading of the current situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very murky, the political outlook of the country, because essentially we've had this roadmap that was predicated on having elections at the end of the year, and then that didn't take place because of legal controversies over the candidates, over, with factions saying that one candidate or the other was not eligible to run. There were judicial recourses and so on. So this officially led the head of the Electoral Commission to say, I'm freezing this electoral process until we resolve these issues.
And does that then make, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the problem, however, is that when the elections were officially delayed at the beginning and then now indefinitely postponed, it gave room to political actors, including some of those who were presidential candidates, to lobby for an indefinite postponement of the elections. And they are instead now heavily, calling for the appointment of a new interim government. Some are rehashing the constitutional track and saying that the country needs to end, this constitutional process before going into elections, and so on. So it's unclear what the path ahead is, and we're still seeing factions sort of engaged in this tug of war over what should happen next. And there's also little clarity and little room for maneuver, I must say, from the UN side. On the one hand, still calling for elections to take place, but some serious problems that need to be resolved if we want elections to take place.
Well, given the political stalemate you've described, does that increase the possibility of renewed armed conflict between Libya's warring factions?
Well, on a positive note, we have to admit that Libya of today is very different than the Libya of 2 years ago. Whilst one might think that this political feuding that is taking place could easily inflame conflict, and in fact, I remember being in Tripoli, just a few weeks before the scheduled election date, and
this would have been late 21.
In late 21, yeah, in December, I was there in early December 21, and the mantra at the time was like, elections need to happen because otherwise war is going to break out, right? Those who were in favor of elections were always repeating this argument that it's either elections or it's war. And in fact, war didn't break out. Why? And this is the positive note that I'm referring to, because essentially the foreign backers of Libya's rival factions, which over the past years had been, supporting financially and militarily their allies in Libya, in the civil war, are now very much in a hands-off position. They have absolutely no appetite to fund a war or support it logistically. And these countries are, the UAE and Egypt and Russia sort of on one side, supporting the forces of Haftar,
Turkey and Qatar on the other.
And Turkey and Qatar on the other. These groups of countries are themselves reconciling amongst each other. So this regional de-escalation is helping things keep quiet. Also, the members of these rival factions are very busy in their own deal making amongst each other. So the new paradigm of today is that Haftar and Tripoli-based leaders such as Fatih Bashaga, the former interior minister, are actually trying to push forward a common agenda between each other. So there is a resumption of dialogue between former enemies. There's a regional de-escalation that is helping things stay quiet. And there's also, I must say, just generally in Libya, little appetite amongst the Libyan youth to take arms to fight for a cause now. There's very little inclination to sacrifice one's life for these political matters at this point in time.
And that brings me to the next question, which is whether they're actually fighting for a cause. Because if we look at the main contenders for leadership in Libya today, we have the warlord Khalifa Haftar, who you mentioned, the current Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeiba, who had indicated very early on that he would not contest the presidential elections and then changed his mind and said he would, and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi's son. Are these three and perhaps others simply rivals for power, representatives of distinct geographical and tribal constituencies, and as you mentioned, proxies for competing regional powers? Or do they also represent distinct political agendas about how Libya should be structured?
Well, they have, they're all, these three gentlemen you mentioned and others all have different political agendas and have a different electorate base as well. I would say that Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibeh played his cards tactically when he entered the race for president, not because he wanted to become president, but because those around him wanted to avoid going into presidential elections. So they knew that by throwing him into the game, they would undermine the chances of elections.
So it was Operation Sabotage.
It was Operation Sabotage, and it was great. They did it. I mean, they did it. They thought it out, and it worked. Right. And so, you know, Dbeibeh represents one of those who his constituency enjoys the support. I mean, he enjoys the support of those who predicate against having an elected president. First of all, so this is already a political agenda. Mainly Tripoli based, and is somebody who conceives of politics in a very transactional way, and he's he's been able to survive the political feuding in Libya in that way. He's also sort of won some support because of his largesse in giving grants to people, to youth. More recently, marriage grants of the value of about $10,000 per couple, and so on. So this is where he's coming from. Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, of course, enjoys widespread support in various parts of Libya, mainly in the south, where he's based, where the Gaddafi have a strong rear base, but the population in the south is relatively small, very small actually. But he does have support both in East and Western Libya as well. Those who support him are the disaffected chunks of the Libyan population. Those who, 10 years after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, look back at at those days as a time of peace and quiet, and so some of them say, at the end of the day, Saif al-Islam got it right, because in his public speeches in 2011, he had told us and forewarned us of the chaos that would ensue had we gone down this revolutionary path. Right. And so there are many people in Libya that are at odds with the current, chaos of the country, and see Saif or former regime officials, but mainly him, as a face for not a return to the past of the Muammar regime, but as somebody who knows how to, they think, deal with Libya's complex.
But it gets the nostalgia vote as well.
It gets the youth nostalgia. It gets the nostalgia vote, but not of the old people, mainly of the young people actually, who probably didn't even live through the Muammar days. Khalifa Haftar, of course, is at odds with Saif al-Islam. He's at odds with Dbeibeh. And, he represents, and he, those who vote for him are mainly in Eastern Libya and in the capital Tripoli, where Haftar has also support, where, people who really want to see the strongman, the military in power, and think that the solution is something like an Egyptian model, where you have a military/president in power who can control the country. So yes, these three men have different sort of regional alliances, but it's Dbeibeh being mainly in Tripoli, Saif mainly in the south, and Haftar mainly in the east. But they do also have sort of different political models that they project. Now, the irony is that nobody's actually standing on, presenting themselves on a political agenda. I haven't seen anybody making political speeches or presenting a program or having a vision for the country. Zero. And this is,
it sounds like they're very much appealing on the basis of what they take to be their personal qualities. Vote for me because I will save Libya, rather than, as you said, any clear and distinct political or socioeconomic agenda they're proposing.
Exactly. I mean, there were 98 presidential candidates that presented themselves for these elections. And I think, I mean, I was only able to come across one candidate who actually wrote out a full-fledged sort of vision for the future of Libya. And that person is Aref Nayed, Libya's former ambassador to the Emirates. But all the others, and mind you, also Nayed sort of projects sort of this persona, vote for me, but at least he had an agenda. All the others, no trace of a political platform.
So looking at it perhaps in a bit of a broader regional context, one of the things that contrasted Libya with its neighbors, Tunisia and Egypt, is that foreign intervention was central to regime change in Libya in 2011. And to what extent does this international involvement help explain the country's current predicament?
Well, the war in Libya was, as you said, from the outset in 2011, a foreign-driven war, responding to, an uprising that did take place in the country, but foreign involvement was central to the downfall, of course, of Muammar Gaddafi. And in the following years, it continued. It never disappeared. I mean, we didn't, the NATO-led intervention in 2011 ended by the end of that year. But ironically, the various foreign states that were involved in that intervention increasingly sort of lay their hands and forged alliances with local armed groups that they had, some of whom they had supported in the 2011 war. So essentially, we started to see the UAE, continue to take responsibility. What Emirati officials claim was their responsibility to finish, what was
responsibilities started, everywhere.
What was started in 2011, and continue to support Libyan forces. Of course, the polarization that hit the Gulf and hit the region also affected Libya. So it started to become a tit for tat. So more Emirati involvement implied more Qatari involvement, financial support, and Egyptians as well started supporting forces in eastern Libya.
If I could just interrupt you, it seems like the 2013 coup in Egypt represented something of a turning point as far as Libya is concerned, because all of a sudden you have this very influential immediate neighbor openly throwing in its lot with one of the warring parties. Is that a correct reading?
Yeah, it must be said that with regards to Egypt, we have to remember that Egypt in 2011, when the war in Libya took place, Egypt was so engraveled in its own problems that it wasn't an actor in Libya in 2011 at all. 2012 passed, and only in 2013, with the changes in Egypt, did Egypt start behaving as an international actor and a protagonist in Libyan affairs. And that's why we start seeing in 2014 Egypt, together with their Emirati allies, asking themselves a question, which is, what do we do on our eastern border? And the support for Haftar was very much, which started in 2014, was very much predicated on this idea that Egypt needed to secure its border with Libya because of infiltration of terrorist groups and weapons and so on. So Egypt also asked for the Emirati support to ensure that the destabilization in eastern Libya, where we have to remember at the time was already undergoing huge problems, because we started seeing a regular and frightful amount of assassinations of security officials. We started seeing, Islamist based armed groups. After a while, we started seeing more Ansar Sharia, more Al-Qaeda inspired groups being based in Eastern Libya. So to go back to the Emirati Egyptian involvement, it was sort of predicated on A, securing the eastern border, and B, on the continuing this fight against terror, because in their views, forces in Tripoli were too complacent towards the jihadist groups, or in some cases just simply the Muslim Brotherhood, and so they started in parallel supporting Khalifa Haftar,
and this included, if I recall, the direct deployment of the Egyptian and Emirati air forces within Libya at one point.
Yeah, it was very brief in 2014, just a couple of airstrikes. It didn't repeat itself, as far as we know, up until the war against Tripoli in 2019. But it was a show of force at the time. Undoubtedly, there was also, for the Egyptians, also, was very important was this very cruel beheading of Egyptian workers on a beach.
This was Islamic State at the time.
It was the first signs of the Islamic State. And so this sort of, accelerated the Egyptian Emirati sort of support to Haftar, to the point that the Emiratis built an airbase outside Benghazi, in the Khadim airbase, and continued to support him. On the other side, we had support from the Qataris, as mentioned, and a lot of failed sort of UN-backed and European-backed attempts to sort of reform Libya's security sector and bring a more sort of cohesive sort of military apparatus together. And then later, at a later stage, we start seeing the Russians being involved. So Russians start, and the Turks much later. So the Russians start coming into the picture in about 2018, again to train, 2017, I must say, to train Haftar-led forces. To train Haftar-led forces. The Jordanians were training Haftar-aligned forces as well. Egyptians were training the pilots. But on the other side, on the Tripoli side, there were failed, training attempts done by Italy, by the UK, where Libyan soldiers were sent and then sent back home soon after because they were involved in some local scandal.
So if I could just ask, because what we had here was somewhat similar to Yemen, perhaps. You had an internationally recognized government in Tripoli, which had at least formal support of the international community. But then I think you also had some leading members of the former coalition, like France, effectively throwing their support behind Haftar. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. But again, that, one of the reasons why France, started supporting Haftar forces. And again, we must remember, I was in Eastern Libya, what was it, 2016? And a helicopter, one of Haftar's helicopters was attacked and fell. And there were 4 Frenchmen on board of that helicopter.
Tourists.
That was the, their role was not shooting, but identifying the locations where there were militants, and so preparing the target. So that's when we start, first having official sort of verification of French involvement, and that's part of the French. The reason why France starts doing this is in part because of France's very strong military and intelligence ties with the Egyptians, first of all, and also with the Emiratis, very friendly, and also an internal French reasoning over, French more than other European countries. Italy, I'm Italian, was very much afraid of the, repercussions of jihadist activities on French soil as well. So this sort of created an automatic stronger ties between Paris and Cairo than Rome, for example, or London. So this was another factor. Turks arrive much later. So real Turkish involvement starts with the war of 2019, when Haftar, with the support of France, Russia, Egypt, and the UAE, launches this attack against Tripoli. Here we are at the apex.
And he's on the outskirts of Tripoli at one point.
More than the outskirts. When I was many years ago, I used to live in Tripoli in this neighborhood called Salahuddin, which is still urban Tripoli, and I remember in early 2020, so about 6 months into the war, Haftar forces were just a few meters away from what was my former house. So it's not, we're not talking about the countryside around Tripoli. Yeah. It's still sort of periphery of Tripoli, the shabby areas of Tripoli, if you want. So Haftar, with all this foreign support, managed to reach the periphery of Tripoli. Literally, we're just 5 kilometers from downtown. But it didn't manage to advance, in part because Haftar's attack on Tripoli triggered Turkish support. Turkish officials signed an agreement with Libya, with the then government of national accord, to agreeing to bring in drones, aerial support, heavy artillery, and so on, to defend Tripoli and prevent it from falling in the hands of Haftar. And this intervention was also an action-reaction sort of dynamic between regional countries that were at loggerheads with one another. Again, Turkey didn't want Libya to fall under the aegis of its foe, Cairo or Abu Dhabi, and therefore intervened and had in return sort of what it wanted, which was a maritime deal. But this, to say that up until 2020, international involvement sort of increased. But now we're seeing as a withdrawal, if you want, where these important actors, until not long ago, were willing to bankroll these the war in Libya, are no longer on that same mindset.
Yeah. Claudia, I'd like to return to the political process and ask perhaps a more general question, which is, in your view, what has the Libyan experience taught us about the role of elections as an instrument of political transition? Has the failure to conduct regular parliamentary and other elections been a primary cause for the country's difficult transitions? Or have elections, in fact, contributed to polarization within the country? In other words, should the nature of Libya's political system, in your view, be determined by elections, or would Libyans be better served by power-sharing arrangements and political consensus on constitutional issues before competing for political power?
That's a very pertinent question, because that's at the heart of the tensions that we're witnessing today in Libya. On the one hand, factions who say, the only hope and the only way out of these years of chaos is elections, and others that are saying that pinning one's hope in election is a futile aspiration.
If I could just interrupt you, one reason I'm asking this question is because if you look at other states in the region that have conducted elections in the context of conflicts, one can think of Iraq and Palestine, for example. Those are examples where elections have contributed to, rather than decrease, the level of political polarization. I'm curious whether you see a similar dynamic in Libya.
Yeah, let's say that that Libya has a negative track records of elections. I mean, if we have to look back at the last parliamentary elections that were held in 2014, Indeed, they were divisive, and they triggered what then became a split of the country into rival institutions. The elections per se then were not contested, but a series of dynamics and legal appeals and a Supreme Court sort of order practically nullified those elections, and Libya split into two between those who supported this ruling and those who were against it. So we can say that if we're looking at the track record of elections in Libya, yes, there are a track record of division, of creating division. On the other hand, Libya also has an experience of power sharing agreements, okay? So the UN-backed mediation attempts after the failed elections, so 2015, brought to an agreement and to a new government headed at the time by Fayez Sarraj that was supposed to, represent your quintessential power sharing agreement. So let's have, representatives of the various factions come together, and it created this nine-headed monster where you had a presidency council of 9 of various officials representing different.
Perhaps a kind of council only the United Nations could have devised.
Yeah, exactly. And it was and very quickly it mushroomed from 3 to 9, representing different regions and different political parties. But that didn't resolve things in Libya either, because it failed to unify the country. It was supposed to be a power sharing agreement, but one side, one faction, the Haftar aligned faction, withdrew and never recognized this UN-backed government. Okay, so it essentially failed to deliver on what it was created for, which is unification of the country. Okay, fast forward to 2020. So Libya has, after 5 years of divided institutions where you have a Tripoli-based government and an East-based government, in 2020, we have a new form of power sharing agreement, right? Which is this UN-backed government of national unity, GNU now, headed by the current Prime Minister, Abdelhamid Beba. It officially brings the country together, so great. And as we said in our report, Libya turns a page because we finally managed to unify these institutions. But was this deal able to guarantee the progress that the country needs and the a return to sort of a legitimacy of the state institutions? No. So 9 months into that government, or 10 months since that government was formed, we're seeing again a feud between East-based officials and Haftar and the current prime minister, and the parliament withdrawing confidence to the to Beba. So even this idea of power sharing agreements or elite deals, as you want to call it, as being a resolution to a country's problems, in Libya, there's a negative track record on that.
And so that hasn't worked either.
That hasn't worked either. And in fact, one of the reasons why the UN in 2020 sort of backed wholeheartedly this notion of going for elections was because Libyans themselves were saying, we've tried power sharing. Right. It doesn't work. We don't want to share power. We don't want to share power. We want to have our elected president. Now, again, if you go back to comparative studies and World Bank reports, they seem to suggest that power sharing deals are the best sort of solution to transit a country from a state of conflict. But in Libya, it's the reason why elections were called for was to return legitimacy to the institution. So essentially that.
Yeah, maybe it's a follow-up question, because you're so often referring to the UN, which raises a question of have we had too much UN peacemaking and mediation? In other words, it seems like the various Libyan parties have been able to kind of offload their responsibilities for reaching a solution among themselves to the UN mission, and the UN mission keeps, let's say, formulating one ineffective body after another impotent institution. And the question becomes, has the UN been too involved in a process that should be much more strongly led by Libyans themselves?
Mm. See, it's I think there's an underlying debate over, how much Libyan agency there should be, as opposed to, UN-led processes. And tracing that, finding the right balance is very difficult, in the sense that, on the surface, what you say of, should there be more Libyan-led processes and let Libyans resolve their things is of course, what we need. But when you unpack the Libyan institutions, the question then is always, which Libyans are supposed to, decide the roadmap? Are we talking about the parliament? Because the parliament's divided, and it's very hard to get agreement amongst parliamentarians. And as one member of parliament just recently said, actually 2 days ago, she went into the hall of the parliament and says, "Who are we fooling here? We're talking about nominating a new government, but we know that we're all corrupt and everybody takes rashwas, and so there's no real spirit of patriotism." In our decision making, we're just following, people here in this hall are just following their own interests. So is it the parliament that is the Libyan, agent of change or of decision of political roadmap? Is it the government officials, right? So should it be Dbeiba? Should it be the Tripoli-based council? Should it be the armed groups? So when you try to think of a Libyan-led or giving Libyan agency to the political process, you're always coming against this problem of which is the Libyan institution that should take lead. Plus the problem of, what I talked about earlier, of this self-perpetuating sort of interest groups of people who have access to funds and have, with these funds can preserve their positions of power. So where does the UN, where does the UN-led process or UN-backed process come in? First of all, to mediate between all these rival actors. Two, to try to push for change, given that the Libya sort of state infrastructure seems to be geared on resisting change. Okay, and where the UN comes in is foreign powers. At a certain point, the UN's job is also to ensure that all these rival foreign states that have been heavily involved in Libya up until last year are on the same page. Because remember, in the moment in which one foreign power gives their green light to one not unofficially, unofficial faction to operate in such a way, you undermine any political process. Yeah. So it's a difficult balance, but the UN still has a key role to play. And I think now more than ever, as we see these feuding factions pulling the rope in their own camp.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as this discussion, I think, is demonstrated, the focus on Libya's political transition and other high-profile issues like migration or terrorism, as you were discussing, have led generally to a neglect of socioeconomic conditions within the country as a driver of conflict. And in this context, do you consider the growing deterioration of the Libyan economy and increasing poverty among Libyans as a significant factor in understanding its present circumstances?
I wouldn't say that the increasing poverty of Libyans of the lower class or the middle class. I mean, what we've seen in Libya is an impoverishment of the middle class. Libya used to be one of Africa's, highest earning pro capita countries, and what we've seen is your middle class completely go down in terms of purchasing power and living conditions. But what you've also seen is a small elite enrich itself in tremendous ways. So I wouldn't say that it's the impoverishment of the Libyan population at large that is a driver for conflict or a trigger for political change. No, I mean, what we're seeing is a very silent, impoverished section of society. Where the drive, the trigger for conflict comes and the decision making for that comes is from that very small elite that has been quickly enriched by the war economy, factions.
And this is a new elite. This is not a continuation of the pre-2011 elite, or is it a hybrid of the two?
No, absolutely not. It's a completely new elite. So it's who was out of power in 2011 came in and because of ties to state officials, because of ties to the central bank, were able to capitalize on the war economy. So essentially, use in its own favor the discrepancy between official and exchange rate or fraudulent letters of credit, and overnight became not millionaires, billionaires. And it's this interest groups that has, is a financial component, but also has political allies and military allies, of course, because these same groups are also funding militias and funding their own allied armed groups, is the driver for conflict. So it's their interest to maintain hold of power or to remain recipient of this sort of state-funded economy that they benefit from.
Well, and that takes me directly to my next question, which is that Libya, as you well know, was for decades a major oil producer and holds the largest proven reserves on the African continent. And to what extent has the struggle for control over its hydrocarbons, whether by local or foreign actors, been a significant factor in its conflict? And I suspect it also has to do very much with this new and narrow elite that you've been describing.
Yeah, I think there's, when we look back at 2011, there was always this lingering idea that foreign involvement in Libya was dictated by interest to control its oil sector and oil economy and so on. But we haven't really seen that play out. So if that was the assumption of countries that led the 2011 intervention, then their calculations strongly backfired, because we didn't see heavily France heavily benefiting from its intervention, or the US. No, not at all. Actually, most US companies withdrew and sold their shares of Libya's oil sector. So I wouldn't say there's a foreign-driven or international interest in Libya's oil sector per se. It's Libyan actors, of course, that have over the years capitalized on two things. One is the physical control of the oil and gas infrastructure. Libya's oil and gas infrastructure tends to be centered around the Gulf of Sirte, the central part of Libya, and there are pipelines for thousands of kilometers going down south from that central area called the Oil Crescent. So the physical control of these installations, which literally means, who has the men guarding these oil installations,
and who's selling
always no, it's mainly the physical control. Just the physical control was used to bargain for money, for contracts, for power also. So leveraging the physical control. So that's one thing. And in fact, because of this, we've seen Libya's oil exports and production plummet at times because of closures of the oil sector. Okay, and this has created tremendous loss for the Libyan state. So hundreds of billions, more than $100 billion over the past 10 years were lost because of these forced closures of the oil sector. Another thing is, of course, the control over the revenues generated by Libya's oil sector. So 95% of the state funds are derived from oil sales in Libya. And that's another thing that this elite has been eager to control. So and the funds accrue to the central bank. So essentially it has become a feud over who controls and who gets a say over what state funds are used for and who they're distributed to. So this is another layer of Libya's feud over state funds. So it's different from the oil and gas infrastructure. It's different from the oil company, so the national oil company, that is more of a technical vehicle to manage oil exports and imports. But it's a central fund that the central bank's funds that have been object of desire and of the various elites that have been able to profit from this preferential access to these state funds.
So as a final question, at the outset, you, I think, explained very clearly what went wrong in Libya in 2021. And on that basis, I'd like to ask you, what are your hopes and also your expectations for Libya in 2022?
Look, I think one of the lessons of the past is that Libya remains a highly unpredictable country. So it's hard to see what this year will offer us, whether it will offer us another power sharing agreement, which some factions now would like to see, or if we're going to see elections take place at some point this year. What we do know is that it'll be a relatively stable year. I don't expect kinetic activity, so this is good news. We're going to see more dialogue and de-escalation between Libya's rival actors. And we'll see huge oil revenues because prices are high and the country we don't foresee much disruption in the oil sector in the near future. Of course, what this also means is that if there's no accountability, no oversight, bad management of the funds, we could also be, this could also be a predicament for greater embezzlement and a greater corruption and a self-perpetuation, as I mentioned, of those currently in power. And unfortunately, this would mean giving Libyans less chance to have their voice heard and their will respected.
On that note, Claudia Gazzini, I'd like to thank you once again for sharing your expertise and insights with us on Connections. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.